Well, thank you, Paul, for being here. I've told the class a little bit about you. This is a wonderful class. There's just such an interesting group. There's such interesting perspectives. We've been exploring mindfulness. We're just not yet halfway there, but we've been making nice inroads through the focused attention practice. We've just gotten into the body scan practice. We've talked a little bit about mindful walking, which I recall you talking with some of your colleagues at the firm and others about it. I raised that. You're familiar with at least some of the readings that we've had for this week, as well as they've read and been reminded to read again the return on investment from the study and practice of mindfulness. And they've been practicing do not interrupt in various forms, but we've never had a real full discussion of do not interrupt. So just everyone, Paul is a dear friend. Paul is an extraordinary attorney. Paul is for me a mentor, a colleague, just the best of all sorts of ways that we can relate to each other. I feel very blessed to have Paul and his wife, Marta, and family in our life. And that's why it's such a joy to share Paul's wisdom and just who Paul is with you all, and to have you all be shared with Paul, because I feel very much honored and delighted that we're having this opportunity this semester. Um, Paul has brought mindfulness into the legal profession, and probably as much as anybody else has in the profession, Paul has the position of a lawyer in a law firm and playing a leadership role both in his law firm and in the legal profession. So there's so much that can be brought into this conversation, and the opportunity to do it with Paul really allows for it being approached from a variety of different perspectives.
Wow. Well, if we were in a courtroom litigating a case, the right thing to do for an advocate would be to say nothing, because with an introduction like that, it can only go downhill when I start speaking instead of listening. So thank you, Scott. Um, for the benefit of your students, and Scott has heard me say this before, some of us sometimes think about regrets. I sometimes think about regrets. I'm going to open with telling you that from a personal life and professional life perspective, one of my biggest regrets is that I did not have or make the opportunity to begin my study and practice of mindfulness earlier in my life and earlier in my career. And I owe a very meaningful part of the intellectual curiosity that I had for the study and practice of mindfulness to Scott. I'm forever, Scott, in your debt for that. And I mean that sincerely. Um, the um, return on investment for me for or from my study and practice of mindfulness and applying it in my personal and professional life is indescribable. And I want to connect up that phrase and the title of the little article that was in your reading materials to um, how it is that I've chosen to go about visiting with lawyers and judges for many years now about the study and practice of mindfulness. And the premise underlying that title, the reason for it, instead of whole bunches of other words that I could have used, uh, was to go to where the audience is. I'm a business lawyer. I principally focus in matters pertaining to financially distressed businesses, people who want to buy them, people who are owed money from them, and no one who does what I do would be wise to call him or herself a bankruptcy lawyer, because people don't like that notion. They don't want to be anywhere near a bankruptcy lawyer because they think that means that they might need one, or nothing good comes of that title. I purposely refer to myself as a business lawyer, and in engaging with clients and prospective clients and colleagues, I try to use the vocabulary of my audience. Lawyers, well, when I came to the study and practice of mindfulness, I was more than a little bit cynical. Um, and that's an understatement. Um, that cynicism didn't last long, um, but I found that I've been most effective in trying to set the hook for other lawyers, both inside our firm and outside, by talking about the study and practice of mindfulness from a business vocabulary. I write in one of the pieces I did, and sometimes when I speak, that a lot of people, before they engage, have the view that talking about mindfulness is something that people do in California in hot tubs drinking Chardonnay. There's kind of this touchy feely. I see some people smiling and nodding. A touchy feely um, vibe. One of the most frequent questions that I get asked about the study and practice of mindfulness, particularly by older lawyers, is, won't I lose my edge if I tip my toes in these waters? Won't I lose my edge? I still don't really understand the question, but there must be something there because it's prevalent. So what I wanted to do was open by the headline that um, the study and practice of mindfulness, which is ongoing for me, um, has been one of the most significant um, undertakings in my life, personally and professionally, and has paid the highest return on investment of nearly any undertaking in my life. And I hope that you all realize how fortunate you are to have your exploration of the study and practice of mindfulness happening now, much earlier in your career than it happened for me, and moreover, that your mentor and guide to the study and practice of mindfulness and the introduction to it is Scott. Um, if you haven't yet discerned this from your readings in this space, especially if you've gone out of your the assigned materials, and I've scrolled that in the curriculum, um, Scott is one of the foremost teachers of the study and practice of mindfulness in the country, bar none. And that small group of distinguished thought leaders and teachers holds Scott in the same high regard. So treasure these moments that you're working with Scott and learning from Scott. And I hope that that what you're learning will be even a fraction of as important for you as it has been for me. So that's kind of the opening. What I want to do with our time is learn from you all. That's one of the best parts of every opportunity that Scott affords me to come and visit with his classes every term. And I want to specifically make myself available to answer your questions, because you all know what you want to know or explore with me. Um, and that's much more important than me just talking a lot. So I'm going to try to do what I jokingly say, um, which is lawyers are generally horrific listeners. And we can talk about that after you share about your do not interrupt exercise experiences. And I can tell you why I think um, many lawyers are horrific listeners later. But this is um, your time with me. So we can proceed this way. I'd love to hear about your experiences with the do not interrupt exercise. And I want to make myself available to answer questions that you have. that come from the return on investment article, or that have been occasioned by anything I've said so far. So who would like to start, and where would you like to start?
And raising a hand probably will just be a good way to, and I see Matt raising his hand, and Paul, please feel free to call
Okay.
on who.
Yep. Matt, thank you for grabbing the talking stick first and having the courage to share.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for being here. I guess a notice or an observation I made during the do not interrupt practice was how in about half the instances, the person I was talking to or communicating with, they almost seemed to expect interruption. And I don't know if that was, part of, I interrupt, or whether they're just expected to have people interrupt them while they're speaking. So in some cases, they almost seem surprised that someone wasn't talking over them or trying to interject at a certain point, and they almost felt uncomfortable continuing to speak after they had hit that, whatever point in time it was for them during that conversation. And I didn't know, I guess, is that something that is kind of common? Or I mean, obviously it's my experience, so it's interesting, but as someone who ostensibly has done it a lot longer than the rest of us, if that's somewhat of a common observation.
I'm so grateful to you for putting this question in play. And before I answer, Matt, with your permission, can I poll the group? Did anybody else have the experience that Matt described? I see on my first screen lots of folks, second screen too. Wow. Anybody else want to amplify on the experience before I respond? Have a slightly different take, or any particularly impactful interactions with your counterparty who express surprise either verbally or by her or his body language on not being interrupted?
I see Veronica and John and Austin. So maybe Veronica.
Yeah, I had a similar experience, and in the conversation, I kept trying really hard not to interrupt, and the person just kept going and kept going and kept going, and then he got to a point where he was annoyed that I was not interrupting or say something. Why are you just quiet? And like the reaction was kind of like defensive, like, why are you not saying anything? Why are you just sitting there listening to what I'm saying? That was my experience.
Wow. I mean, just think about together what that means, that about communication habits and practices and patterns, that a counterparty was annoyed and off put by not being interrupted. I just think that is staggering. Thank you, Veronica, for sharing that. Anybody else want to add anything, and then we can I can respond to Matt, and we can advance the discussion.
John, did you?
Sure. So I agree with Matt 100%. I had an opposite effect than Veronica did. I found the conversation to be much more fulfilling and enriching, and so did the other person too. The lack of interruptions actually motivated them to keep talking, and I could tell that they were happy that they had the talking stick and that they were able to keep it uninterrupted.
That's really interesting as well. I think that people will get there, in my experience, after repeated assurances, verbally and in the manner in which we're presenting, that the failure to interrupt is not evidence of a lack of attention or 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 a lack of interest. Um, Especially now in the pandemic, when much of our interaction is virtual, And when a lot of that virtual interaction is by phone or by Zoom with video not connected, it takes discipline, maybe more than in a real-time engagement, to stay focused and to resist multitasking. I think that's always a challenge and a temptation, but now um, I can't tell you all the number of times a day, not a week or a month, that I am on a Zoom meeting. There are participants only on audio, and a question will be put to a participant. There'll be no response, and the default safe answer now is, "Oh, I'm sorry, I had you on mute." Now, indeed, sometimes that's the case, that the counterparty had her or his audio on mute. I think many times the reality is that the counterparty had to have her or his name called out multiple times because she or he wasn't paying attention. And consider the ramifications of communication flow if the expectation is that your counterparty is not paying attention. It's pretty profound. So I want to talk about two things, coming back to where Matt started us. And one is a communication pattern generally, and where we are societally. And then I want to talk about lawyers and interrupting. And I want to talk about lawyers as data gatherers. Okay, does that sound okay? So I, Matt, have the same experience you described, and that others nodded their head about or smiled about. And having given thought to this and written a little bit about it, talking about it with others, I remain absolutely confounded that it causes discomfort in a communication for a counterparty not to be interrupted. I don't know how we got here, but every time I try to think through, why is my counterparty annoyed because I'm not interrupting, I honestly don't know the answer. Um, I don't have a solution for it. I remain emphatically committed to the mission of not interrupting, with a big footnote that I'm going to come back to, a big footnote about not interrupting. I remain emphatically committed to that mission for a whole bunch of reasons. And I don't want to fight every fight. I don't want to make not interrupting the thing we're talking about instead of the subject that we're talking about with a counterparty. And one thing that's been effective for me is to redouble nonverbal communication in the exchange, to work harder at eye contact, and to work harder to send messages, nonverbal messages of engagement, head nodding when something's funny or could be funny, a smile when something's not funny, to have a facial expression. And this isn't contrived. We do it anyway. I just think about it more, of hearing something shocking and indicating in a nonverbal way that I'm still with them. When given the opportunity by the counterparty, are you listening? You haven't said anything. Then I think it's really effective to say, "Oh, of course I'm still listening. I'm very much interested in what you have to say. I just didn't want to interrupt because I'm learning more from you by listening than interrupting. And not in a judgmental way, not in a way that indicates any, moral superiority because you're not interrupting, but in a way that's plain and simple and truthful, and that reassures the person that you're the counterparty that you're all in on the communication. But where you started and the question, is this common? To me, it's not only common, but I would say that in new interactions, as opposed to interactions with people with whom I regularly interact, and who know my communication patterns, it's an overwhelming majority. Overwhelming. So, Matt, anything you want to follow up on before I transition to a couple other points that I threatened to come back to?
I can't think of anything to follow up on, I guess, aside from my only thought in terms of why people get either uncomfortable or unexpected when they're allowed to continue talking past when they're either used to or societal norms have dictated that it's time for someone to step in, is I think a lot of communication now is based on anticipating another's response and kind of throwing something out there for someone to respond to. And when you do practice this, if they just keep going, then they get uncomfortable, so they start rambling and they're just like, when are you going to start talking? I don't know what else to say. And instead of allowing yourself to stop speaking when your point has been made, or when you feel like the idea you're trying to convey has been conveyed, they just keep going and they don't know when to stop. So I think part of it is the anticipation, versus part of it is people aren't usually allowed to talk for this long in regular conversation, and allowed may not be the right word, but that's the only reason I can kind of think of as to why people feel uncomfortable when they're allowed to fully express whatever idea or thought is going on in their head.
Can I make a quick comment on that?
Sure.
So I had exactly what Matt was just saying. I had made a comment or a note of when I was doing the exercise, and what I came up with, basically my observation was that this, back to the societal norms, is that people expect that they're going to be interrupted, so they've been sort of trained to come up with these more short, kind of hard hitting points, expecting that they're going to be cut off at some point, rather than making these more thought out, carefully thought out, drawn out, logical reasoning arguments. And I think they kind of throw these haymakers that have more sort of kick to them to kind of get their point across, because they've kind of been trained to have limited time. And I think that in itself also perpetuates the cycle, because then their points leave holes or gaps in their reasoning, because they're just kind of get it out quick, and then those holes or gaps other people recognize or pick up on, and that prompts them to interrupt and be like, well, no, that this isn't true, or how'd you get from here to here? And then so that kind of, I noticed that kind of sort of situation in several different conversations that I had. So I think that's why people get uncomfortable, because they made their point and they're like, well, I have so much still left to say, but, and you're quiet and they're like, oh, I could have made this a better point and not had holes in my reasoning, and so on and so forth.
So, Austin, that's a fascinating point, and there's some really important competing tensions there. For those of you who are going to pursue the practice of law, and you're going to pursue a litigation practice, and especially an appellate practice, time management in advocacy is really critical, and a great deal of thought goes into how you're going to make your arguments within the prescribed time, as to which there's usually no or minimal elasticity. So I get people having to train themselves to be mindful of time limits. But it seems to me, and I'll just plant the seed and then move off it because it could take up all the rest of our time and more, that implicit in the point you're making is that the communication would be more efficient and net shorter if there were interruptions. I kind of took that from what you said, that people are fearful they're going to be interrupted, so they throw the haymakers out there, the dramatic points. Um, and what if, let's just test this with this couple of questions and then move off of it. What if, in fact, by not interrupting, the conversation would have stayed more on track in the manner the counterparty wanted it to, instead of gone in directions that the interrupter assumed was what was of import to the counterparty? There's a high
So
risk.
that was actually the point I was making. Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
That
no,
was
no.
what the point I was making. I'm on track with you. That was the point I was making, was that in aggregate, the conversation would be shorter without interruptions, because I think you interrupt and you didn't even get the full picture of what the other person was going to say, where if you had, maybe you wouldn't have the response that you originally had. You know, so I'm on, yeah, I'm in agreement with you there.
What I've observed in both my professional and in my personal life is that most people don't open with the essential point they wish to make, certainly not in a business negotiation, and very frequently not in personal communication, especially intimate personal communication. There's a warm up, right? The same way there is for a car in the winter before the heat blows. Stuff has to start flowing. People sometimes have to hear themselves speaking and get into a mode with which they're comfortable to get to what's really important. Sometimes that happens with me. I want to toss out some points to see if my counterparty's engaged, send some test feelers out about what's really important and see if I can read the tea leaves. So people have lots of different reasons for the way in which they build to the points that really matter. And interrupting can disrupt that flow and the person's comfort level. So I'm going to transition to two professional points. And I'm going to interrupt myself for a moment. Scott, I'm right, aren't I, that today we're aspirationally ending at, is it 11:15? Yeah.
Anytime between 11:15 and 11:30, get based on your schedule.
Okay. Thank you very much. So I want to come to two points that have to do with lawyering before I get to this, what I call the important footnote. In my experience, lawyers, young lawyers, are trained, not expressly, but implicitly, to interrupt. And it's bizarre to me, but prevalent. And it goes like this. Young lawyers watch mentors and more senior lawyers in meetings or on phone calls, sometimes in court, which is mind-blowing, do the following. In the middle of a client speaking or a counterparty speaking, I got it. Counterparty speaking, interrupt, I got it. And it seems the training part of that is that it's a merit badge. It's like a cool thing to be the first to hit that button on the game shows with the answer, because it shows you're smartest and you're most engaged, to assume you know where the person was going and you're demonstrating your intelligence or how prepared you are for the meeting or how smart you are on the particular issue by interrupting to say you got it. And I've watched this dynamic. I was trained in it too. And some lawyers even think that the clients respect it because, wow, my lawyer, I've heard clients say this about lawyers, this lawyer gets it instantaneously. And sometimes clients even think, oh my goodness, I'm so glad the lawyer interrupted me because I'm paying her by the hour and I saved money. I would submit to you that the percentage of times that the lawyer who does, I get it, probably doesn't get it. And in any event, the confirmation of it, the opportunity for the client to confirm was blown. And some clients, especially those that don't interact very frequently with lawyers, get trained to not continue or correct the lawyer or to really give the data that she or he wanted to give, much to their detriment. So I hope that you will consider being very thoughtful about the I get it interruption dynamic and decide for yourself whether you think that's a behavior pattern you want to adopt and whether it serves the image of a lawyer counselor that you want for yourself. The second point is my overriding approach to teaching the study and practice of mindfulness to lawyers. Again, going to where they go, the antithesis of the California hot tub with the Chardonnay, the hard-nosed, this will make you better, is, hey, is there anybody who wants to refute the proposition that knowledge is power? And most lawyers tend to be comfortable with that notion. Knowledge is power. And I advance that the underpinning of knowledge is data, and the people who are most efficient and effective at gathering data have the most knowledge, and they're going to win, whatever the definition of win is in the circumstance. I will submit to you that you will gather much more data listening than talking. So if you're interrupting, you're talking. If you're interrupting, you're cutting off the data that your counterparty wants to give you. And if that counterparty is your client and she or he is getting to what's important to her or him in her or his own way, think about what that means. Moreover, if the counterparty is your adversary in a deal or a case or whatever, and you're cutting off her or him from telling you what's important to get the case resolved or the deal done, or data that you could get to use against her or his client, the counterparty, what sense does that make? Just gather the data. You can filter for what was relevant, and yes, it may be 5 minutes out of your life or 10, or it may be a whole day out of your life that you'll never get back that didn't really give you actionable data to help you win, whatever win means. But you're not going to get data that you need interrupting if you're thoughtful about what's happening, but not simply rehearsing what you're going to ask when your counterparty stops speaking, which is not at all mindful listening. You'll get the data you want, and you'll probably get it more efficiently, and you'll certainly get it in a way that preserves options to get more data from the same counterparty later. How many of you have ever had the experience of saying, oh geez, I've got to have another conversation with X, and it's not a lot of fun. X chronically interrupts, and I don't feel heard. I've had that experience. Yeah, so I see some hands up. So I want to tell you the big footnote. And it goes back to one of the questions about, will all this make me lose my edge, whatever that means, especially from women and men who litigate. I don't want you to think that I don't interrupt. Sometimes I interrupt because I've failed in my commitment to mindful listening, and I don't do it purposefully or strategically. Nobody's perfect. Sometimes I interrupt very purposefully and strategically. And I don't want you to think that this is a binary toggle. The point about the do not interrupt exercise and mission could be more thoroughly defined or described, at least in my view, by saying the exercise is do not interrupt mindlessly. If you're going to interrupt, have a reason for it, not when you make up after the fact to justify it, but for example, and then I'm going to move off this point. I recently was in a Zoom mediation with a very challenging opposing counsel who had his yet more challenging client representative on the Zoom, as is usually required in court-ordered mediations. And the very aggressive, in my view, rude and obnoxious counterparty client started in on our firm's client, and it got ugly and personal, including some vulgarities which I don't care about, and then called our client a liar. And I decided very purposefully to interrupt, in fact, with a purposefully raised voice, and say, that will never happen again. The next time that happens, this mediation is over, and probably the opportunity to resolve this case pre-trial is over. And that was, I promise you, in this instance, that's not an after the fact made up explanation or justification. It didn't work perfectly, but it did set a boundary that I thought was important. And I will tell you, if you're going to mindfully, strategically, tactfully, purposefully interrupt, in order for it to be effective, it has to be sparingly done. So that's the big footnote to the do not interrupt exercise that I wanted to share. So we have some time left, and I want to be open to questions that others have, either following on this topic or from the article, from anything I've said, or something that we haven't covered in the readings. So it's open mic for you all again. Let me see, John.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I would like to know, what does your daily regimen look like in your mindfulness practice? Because I'd like to have a model to base it off of once this class comes to an end.
Thank you. That's a really good question. And I'm going to tell you the answer directly, which is, my regimen. And I'm also going to urge that what's more important than what my regimen is that if you're going to commit to this practice, that you find one that is comfortable for you and that works for you. And I'll also say, before I answer your question directly, that I believe that the return on investment increases by the durability of the commitment to practice, even if the duration of the practice is short. That is honoring the commitment to the study and practice by doing it, So my practice is daily. The duration varies. The minimum duration is 10 minutes. I practice first thing in the day. I wake up very early, usually around between 5 and 5:30, and I don't want to. I know myself well enough to know how my days go and my nights go. I don't want to risk having it be 8:30 at night and not having eaten and then saying, crap, I haven't practiced yet today. So I'll tell you that almost barring some family health issue, it's the first thing I do every day. And for me, and this opens a whole nother door that we certainly don't have time for. I have, as part of my daily regimen, also a daily spirituality practice, part prayer, part focus on spirituality separate from my mindfulness practice, and that follows. Is that responsive, John?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah. And my weekend practice is usually longer because I'm usually under less business pressure to start replying to emails and meeting deadlines and stuff, but minimum of 10 minutes during the week.
And one follow-up, if I may, 7 days a week?
7 days a week. Weekends a little. Yep. Now,
Thank
having
you.
said that, and I want to, for those of you who are not there, I will also tell you that that I use the phrase probably more than people want to hear, not to annoy you and others, the study and practice of mindfulness, because my formal practice, at least a disciplined one, followed by maybe a year and a half from my study. And what I mean by study is a pretty disciplined, frequent reading of stuff about mindfulness, articles, books, stuff. And I benefited a great deal from that study before a disciplined commitment to practice. I wish I would have started the practice part earlier too, just like the study part earlier. And the 10 or so minutes to which I referred as the minimum does not include time that I will take during the course of a day to read an inbound email from a variety of mindfulness sources that I subscribe to. Let's see, Juliana, did I pronounce that correctly?
Yes, you did. Thank you. So I wanted to ask you, well, maybe it was two questions, but I'll do one. When I have the sense that normally lawyers have this sort of rejection of implementing these more mindfulness or wellness practices because they have the idea that if they do, well, first they think that it's going to happen what you were mentioning at the beginning, that it will become a little more soft, and that will not work very well in the field. But also that this idea that there's so much going on your on your day, and there's so much stress on your daily activities and so much that you have to get done, that maybe put some of these practices on your daily basis can be like one more burden on your day. So my question was, how were you able to manage this situation, like being able to implement this mindfulness practice and at the same time be able to do all the things that you have to do on a regular day as a lawyer?
Yeah, it's good. It's a really good question. And I'm guessing that it's probably, when even not articulated as a question in groups that I speak to, the question that everybody wants to ask who doesn't ask it, right? So there's a joke, maybe you've heard it in the class already so far from another speaker, maybe Scott's shared an article that had this line in it. And the line is, if you can't find time to meditate for 5 minutes a day, then you need to meditate for 10 minutes a day, right? I know to a certainty, I know to a absolute certainty that I am more productive and more efficient as a result of my practice. I know to a certainty that after my morning practice, when I am ready to file email bankruptcy, and just when I'm exasperated, when I'm aware of sensations and feelings that I can't possibly execute on everything I have to execute on, that if I stop for 2 minutes and just breathe, that I will end up, notwithstanding the expenditure of those 2 minutes, maximizing my prospects of success in executing my goals and commitments for that day. And I think people have to read it. They have to observe others who have a practice, and they have to try it for themselves with an open mind. And it's not a very big leap to see the results. I think you start by, kind of holding your nose and jumping, and then consistently seeing the yield gets people there. And lawyers, your question went specifically to lawyers. Lawyers, for the most part, Juliana, will never tell you they're not busy unless they know you really well. It's another false badge of courage. Oh, I'm so busy. Some lawyers really are, and some really aren't all the time. And the last thing I'll say is, most of us make time, no matter how busy we are, to do what we're comfortable doing and what we like to do. Most of us find a way to make time for that. So the practice, in terms of it being comfortable, it's a discipline. It's just like going to the gym, only exercising one's brain instead of one's body. So let's see. Scott, we're getting really close. May I invite one more question?
Yeah, and I would just encourage voices that haven't been heard to have room to, and we can let a few moments of pause be there for that to happen. But absolutely, Paul, please, and everyone, we have 10 minutes. Do we have 10 minutes, Paul?
Sure.
Is that comfortable?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for asking.
Probably 2 or so more questions, please. Let's do just that.
I had one last thing to add or to ask.
Sure.
Yeah, let me get my
Okay, Austin, you've,
There
but
we go.
you've
There we go.
spoken, if you, is it Austin, are you speaking?
I'm sorry?
Austin, but hang on, let's let voices that haven't yet spoken.
Sure.
Let's first have voices that haven't yet spoken. I think you've spoken so far. I just want to have this opportunity since we're not going to get a chance to talk with Paul, certainly not again in this class. And then Joyce, I think you spoke a little bit, Joyce. Did you? Maybe.
Not to Paul, but that's okay.
No. Jesse, and Joyce, please. I'm sorry, of course.
Okay. Jesse, I think you had your hand up first, and then we'll go to Joyce if that's okay.
Sure. I just had a question about how to differentiate between feeling like you're interrupting somebody and having a conversation with somebody. Because like we were talking about earlier, like how Matt said people were uncomfortable with the non-responsiveness almost of him not interrupting, where I've had a hard time feeling like, where's the line between I'm interrupting them and I'm having an actual conversation with them?
That's a really provocative question. Thank you for offering it. I think that underlying the question, which I get, is that it is the notion that a conversation per se involves interruption. I can't tell you the number of times I've heard from people, in my family, everyone interrupts. That's how we have conversations. And I think that's true of a lot of families. And mind you, the do not interrupt discipline is not necessarily to be emphatically and universally practiced. It's a really, really good discipline to have, but I don't want you to think that it's the only way to communicate. I think that in some families, it would probably be a great source of concern and alarm if a long-standing communication pattern changed without an explanation in advance. And there'd be the risk of, Jesus, what's wrong with Jesse? I mean, what's happening? Something must be going on because she's not participating in the conversation, meaning she's not interrupting. So I think it depends on the context. And I invite you just to consider what I'm positing underlies your question, that in some settings, the way that the participants in those regular settings define conversation is by interrupting. And it's not a sin. It's not a sin at all, obviously, right? I mean, nobody's going to jail. Nobody's going to rot in hell for interrupting. I'm only making the point by my focus on it, which some people might think is a hyper focus, that it's a really useful discipline. And it's immensely valuable in gathering data. So I don't know if that's responsive. I don't think it is probably actually, but I don't think I gave you an answer of your question, which was what's the difference between a conversation and not interrupting? I'm not sure at this moment I have a better answer.
Well, could I just chime in just a little bit on this? And
please.
only to take a minute, because I'd like us to get to Joyce, and then if possible, Austin, although I fear that we may not, but I don't want this to, and I can follow up with the class on this. You sometimes talk about not white knuckling it. Sometimes you'll talk about how when you start to do the do not interrupt, it's so difficult because of the impulse and the habit that you say at first it's like you're white knuckling it, but then in time and practice, noticing, not seeing that everything's okay, gathering more information, realizing the benefits, there's a loosening of it. And I would imagine, and even when the way you described your deliberate interruption or your deliberate forceful, don't say that to my client, and if you do, that's going to be that. It's like are we gripping, and that's why we're interrupting, whether it's a light grip or a very and we can't help ourselves, or is there no grip and we're freed from the impulse And that's the fluid back and forth. That's like a dance. That's beautiful in a conversation I think Jesse's pointing to. But but those are challenging, but that's a real, unencumbered way of being in relationship. And oftentimes we're a little bit more encumbered and it's more challenging. So it's moving in that direction.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. I think that's really, really helpful and much more articulate than my effort to
No,
answer.
that's not what I know. I was interested in you commenting on the white knuckling part and that, because I think that especially when somebody takes it from I was doing it at home to now I'm doing it in a meeting.
Yeah.
Advice on that.
I think Scott, that your point reinforces that I'm not advocating, I'm not proselytizing that the do not interrupt mode of communication is universally applicable and wise and comfortable in all settings, and that indeed the continuum of chronic interruption, mindless interruption, unknowing interruption, to more thoughtful, less frequent interruption. The continuum of white knuckle non-interrupting, which is not, it's part of the discipline and the learning pattern, but it's not itself advancing the goal of gathering data, because all of our energy in hardcore white knuckle listening is in not allowing ourselves to interrupt. And when we're focused that intensely on holding back and figuratively biting our tongue, we're not really open to receiving the data from our counterparty or counterparties. So
Thank you. And do we have time for Joyce?
sure, of course. Hey, Joyce.
Thank you. I appreciate it. You mentioned earlier the obnoxious, aggressive, opposing that's just, really, really combative. All of this sounds great in theory, and of course I want to incorporate it into my practice moving forward. But I do remember that last semester I had a similar kind of seminar thing. We were put into a role playing exercise, and it very quickly got so this one guy, just the kind that just like you're so angry you want to interrupt him by punching him in the face. In that moment, how do you have any techniques to walk yourself back? Because it's so easy to just see red. How is it? Just through experience and practicing and to learn to be patient, or do you have any cues in that moment that kind of set you back where back where you should be?
Regrettably, we all know that dynamic, right? So I'll offer 2 points. And maybe you've studied this so far. The first is one of my goals for advancing the study and practice of mindfulness is to learn to react less and respond more. Those situations that you describe are volatile. They get more volatile and they can risk becoming explosive by increasing reactivity on each side. So there are a number of important tools that are simple and not easy to advance this goal of reacting less and responding more. The first is the discipline of separating the time, if possible, the time between stimulus and response. So when that obnoxious, difficult behavior starts, if I can pause, give myself a chance to do a couple of things. One, remember that I've seen this movie before. I know how this dynamic works. It's not going to get better if I immediately react. The second is, and this goes, I think, to the core of one of my goals for the study and practice of mindfulness, is to develop my self-awareness of the sensations, the feelings, and thoughts of anger, of outrage, of fear, and oh, I'm feeling the way in my palm, maybe a little stickiness that comes from that hard adrenaline rush of anger or being outraged. I'm aware my heart rate accelerated. I feel I feel the tension in my legs, the same way as if I fear or think that someone's going to hit me or take a swing at me or the like. And the ability to come to, oh, hello, sticky palms and accelerated heart rate. Thank you for the vitality that you're offering. I know you're here. Many times the adrenaline-like reactions serve me, like when I need to fight or flight after reflection, and message received, you may be on your way. I mean, that's kind of one of the primary objectives, to heighten through the study and practice of mindfulness what's going on here, and processing that, reflecting on prior instances of experiencing the same thoughts and feelings and sensations, and maybe going back to the questions about, can the study and practice of mindfulness actually save time if you have to stop to practice it? Scott's heard this before. It's really not consistent with any recognized theory of traditional mindfulness practice, but lawyers like hearing about this a lot. And I'll just leave you with this thought. I've posited and tested in some talks that the study and practice of mindfulness can help me control the future. Lawyers love to think about control. It's like, really? I'm in. Sign me up. If I can get more control, I want to control everything. Lawyers love control. And the theory is this: if I engage in that, if I'm reacting to the dynamic you described, to the obnoxious, hostile counterparty, right? There's a chance that I'm going to do something or say something that I'm going to regret. And in our personal lives and in our professional lives, I won't presume for you, but I can tell you that when I screw up and do something that I regret, the time and energy it takes me to fix it, if it's fixable, is robbing more productive, less stressful stuff I can do in the future. So it's a process. It's a discipline. I don't get it right all the time. I can tell you that, 3 weeks ago, I'm still thinking about this. Maybe a month ago, I was in a meet and confer in a discovery session with a lawyer on the other side. It was late on a Friday afternoon. And I said something that I shouldn't have said. I didn't call the person a name, but I said something that was obnoxious, frankly. And the other lawyer was younger and happened to be a woman. And I just thought to myself, oh, I just hate the way I dealt with that woman. It was the gray-haired old guy lawyer, you know, being probably professorial and obnoxious and dismissive. And that's not who I am. And there's no excuse for what I did, but it makes the point that I didn't behave properly. I was reactive for whatever reason, fatigue. I didn't want to be doing what I was doing. I wasn't mindful and present. And think of this. Think of this. It's a month later. It happened on a Friday. It was 4 Fridays ago, maybe 5, and I'm still thinking about it. So separate the time between stimulus and response, if at all possible. Develop the awareness of these thoughts and feelings and sensations and where they've taken you before. Thank them for the messaging that they're providing you, and then thoughtfully respond, or decide you're not going to. You know what? If you think it's uncomfortable, and this goes right to where Matt started us. If you think it's uncomfortable for your counterparty to not be interrupted, I can tell you it's bizarre to be in the situation you described, Joyce, and to say, you know what, let's take a break. Because counterparties, I've had this happen tens of times. No, I don't want to take a break. I want to know blah, blah, right now. No, let's take a break. That's a tool we don't use. It's a really effective tool. And I think that it was alluded to, not in the exact same context, in one of your readings this week, the name of which I don't have memorized, but it referred to, was it Scott, going to the balcony?
Yeah.
So
That's right.
I'm way over, and I've got a whole bunch of folks waiting to prepare for a hearing this afternoon, and I am very
Thank you so
grateful
much.
to Scott for allowing me to come and visit with your class again. And I'm very grateful to all of you for your careful listening, and for those of you who engaged in this discussion to teach me what you're thinking and let me learn from you all.
All righty.
Thank you.
Paul, thank you so much, everyone. Perhaps a
Thank
little
you all.
expression
Thank
of,
you all. Okay.
um,
Take care. Enjoy your class and enjoy this precious opportunity to study with Scott. I hope you get how special it is.
thank you, Paul.
Okay.
Good day.
Thanks.
Thank you for the extra time.
Well, be safe, everybody.